Hello, and welcome to Textbooks, Affordability and Equity of Access, an Inside Higher Ed webcast. I'm Doug Lederman, editor of Inside Higher Ed, and I appreciate you taking time out of your schedules to join us. We're glad to have you here. I am joined today for this presentation by my co-editor and co-founder, Scott Jaschik. The two of us in the first half hour will sort of offer some thoughts about the evolving landscape for instructional materials, touching on topics such as the intensified push for equity in higher education, the significance of non-tuition costs in affordability, and government and institutional initiatives designed to make textbooks and other curriculum materials more affordable and accessible. In the second part of the presentation, Scott and I will respond to your questions and comments. You don't have to wait until that point, though, and we encourage you to start submitting questions as soon as they occur to you. You can do that by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You'll only see the questions that you submit. We won't read your name or your institution in presenting your question unless you specifically want us to. So if you think us having that kind of information, either who you are or the type of place you work at or what you do, would help us answer the question more intelligently and thoughtfully, we'd feel free to include that in the question itself. Before we begin, I wanted to thank Bibliu, whose advertising support has made this webcast possible. Bibliu has a learning enablement platform that helps colleges make digital textbooks and other educational materials accessible to students, and we really appreciate their support for this webcast. Now going to move on to the core of the presentation. I want to start with some background on, before we talk specifically about the landscape for digital materials. I want to talk a little bit about how equity and affordability issues are sort of affecting the way textbooks and other curricular materials are viewed. And compared to the rest of the world, particularly, the US has a strong history of making higher education accessible to a broad swath of its citizens through going back, depending on how far you want to go back, going back to the Land Grant Act and to the GI Bill and the creation of Pell Grants. We've always sort of made accessibility a priority. Despite that philosophy, the country still doesn't deliver really fully on that promise. There major equity gaps remain in college access and attainment by race, socioeconomic status, and other factors. This slide tries to, again, capture this much larger conversation in a little bit of a nutshell. The chart on in this tale of two charts, the one on the left essentially shows how much likelier you are to be enrolled in college and in a four-year college if you're in the top quintile of our economy compared to if you're in the bottom quintile. Again, the numbers are pretty striking. If you're in the top quintile, you're 73% of people who are in ninth grade are still enrolled in a four-year college or have graduated within I think it's 6 years after after they graduated from high school. And the numbers are, a third of that in the lowest quintile. On the right-hand side, you see a slightly different chart, but it shows how much likelier you are to complete college, and either at the institution you initially enrolled in, or at least somewhere if you're white or Asian, than if you are Black or Hispanic. And these again, this only scratches the surface of this issue, but I think what's important is that we had been making progress, I think, as a country, in some progress, modest progress probably, in the years leading up to the pandemic and the recession. But there are lots of worries, as we'll talk about ahead, that those phenomena, compounded by the racial reckoning that the country underwent a couple of summers ago, have set back those accessibility and efforts and the sort of expansion of access to higher education. want to sort of shift now and talk a little bit about sort of some of the reasons for those gaps. And, again, this is another topic we could probably do a whole separate webcast on, and we can't deal in depth with all of them. But and all these issues are somewhat entangled there, but we have a set of systems and processes and policies, things such as overdependence on standardized testing, inequitable recruitment strategies by colleges that exacerbate the very real gaps in educational quality at the K-12 level for those who are sort of coming in or potentially coming into higher education. And together they result in real gaps in academic preparation for different groups of students. There are also state and federal and institutional policies that have historically disadvantaged students from underrepresented groups, minority students, and those from lower socioeconomic incomes, federal funding policies going back to sort of higher education segregation, approaches to developmental education. Again, we can only scratch the surface in talking about these things in this context, but there is there are a set of policies that taken together have really created sort of structural impediments. There are also cultural issues on campuses in terms of sort of significant underrepresentation of minority administrators and faculty members. Certainly plenty of evidence if you look for it of outright racism that students encounter on campuses. And of course, and this is probably what we'll focus on a little bit more in this presentation, are the financial impediments that sort of contribute to the gaps of both entry into college and success within it. Affordability issues disproportionately affect students from particularly from lower socioeconomic classes, but also from certain minority backgrounds. And so taken together, this set of factors are certainly contribute to why we see different outcomes for different groups of students. I want to, again, now dive a little bit more into the sort of affordability issues. And again, another topic that we could spend a whole hour talking about, but gonna sort of breeze through it to get to the core of this. Tuition prices have risen significantly in the last 20 years, but net tuition, which is what students actually pay after accounting for financial aid, has actually fallen over the last decade. And the caveat about that is that some of the reason it's falling is because we've seen a lot more, much significant growth in the availability of loans and the take up of loans. And so, and something of a shift over the last couple of decades from grants to loans in terms of sort of how, and also cutbacks in state support that have led to the students and families taking on a greater burden of the greater share of the costs of their own educations. We have seen tuition increases moderate in the last couple of years, possibly suggesting that the elasticity of what colleges can charge has kind of reached its endpoint. But it also may just be recognition that colleges didn't feel like they could significantly increase tuition at a time when many students and families felt like they were getting something of a suboptimal experience from going to college, either whether they were online or in person. Many of the efforts to improve affordability in higher education focus on tuition. Most of the free college programs, for instance, focus on limiting tuition, when there is plenty of evidence that for many students, especially some of those who are most vulnerable, non-tuition costs are a less obvious, but sometimes almost just as significant a barrier. And the reason the City University of New York is on this slide is that we wrote a story not too long ago about the impact of sort of non-tuition costs on CUNY community college students. 2/3 of CUNY community college students receive federal Pell Grants, and about 1/3 receive money from the state's tuition assistance program. And so as a result, a lot of community college students within the City University of New York, and this is true nationally as well, largely go to college essentially tuition free. But that doesn't mean that there aren't affordability issues. Even though I think it was in 2020, I believe these data are from, the average full-time community college student received about $7,500 in aid, while their tuition was only about $4,800 on average. But there are plenty of expenses, and again, as you'll see, books, textbooks, and other other required supplies cost an average of about $1,350 a year for a community college student in CUNY's estimate. A laptop costs $300. Internets cost $500 to $600 a year. There are all sorts of costs that can, even though tuition is maybe being contained, and we have seen, again, tuition increases moderate in the last couple of years. There's plenty of evidence that non-tuition costs still pose serious affordability issues and barriers to a lot of students. And financial barriers become educational ones, especially in an area like textbooks. The same study from the City University of New York and others have found that when students don't purchase their textbooks, or try and save money by not getting all their curricular materials, there's an educational impact. A study we wrote about in 2017 found that about 40% of students avoided purchasing course materials for at least one of their classes. And again, we know that when students don't have or choose not to get the curricular materials, there's going to be an academic impact that they're going to suffer. So I'm going to shift now a little bit to talking about sort of the what's happening to try to make address these issues around the affordability of curricular materials and textbooks, and it has become, over the last 5 to 7 years particularly, but probably going back even further than that, a focus of a lot of policymakers and think tank analysts and others. One of the factors that's clearly unfolding is a shift from print textbooks to digital. And again, this has been happening over quite a long period of time. It was 10 years ago that the then head of one of the major publishers famously predicted in our Inside Higher Ed's pages that higher education should be done with print textbooks within 3 years. He followed up a year later, talking about the sort of progress on that. Needless to say, like so many things, things happen more slowly than a lot of us, than some people predict, and that's true in higher education, maybe particularly so. But we have absolutely seen, while slower, a shift away from print textbooks and curricular materials to digital, to ebooks, to digital courseware, et cetera. The part of the reason we've seen, there are lots of reasons why the shift has been slower than we may have predicted, or than some people may have predicted. The technology lagged, while there were plenty of advantages of textbooks, of e-textbooks in certain ways. Sorry, didn't mean to advance the slide. We saw, a lot of students still prefer to have a print version, and there have been questions around sort of the technology, which again has, I think, improved, but it's taken time for it to get where students want it. We think that there are definitely issues involving faculty deciding whether to make digital textbooks available. And the instructor's role is really significant here. And so I think we are seeing this trend happen, and that has, as you can see on this slide, sort of helped to bring down the average price of textbooks, that shift to digital. But some of the major barriers are easing, but I think the predictions that it would happen fast, I think they probably come slightly more true, or every year, but not immediate. So Scott, you want to jump in here?
Yes, welcome to today's webcast. I just wanted to give an example. If you take nursing, for instance, and look up a nursing textbook costs, they are $150, $175 easily. So you're, depending on what you're studying, the average cost of textbooks can really be a lot, and with very little control over it. So I just wanted to make that point. Doug, back to you.
Sure. Like so many things in our society, and I'm not sure we fully understand all of them at this point, but the pandemic has altered our world in a lot of ways, and in many cases have had an accelerating effect. And we have seen some impact on the sort of support for and use of digital materials. You see this slide includes some data from a report that we wrote about not too long ago, and we did see about 10% more faculty members saying they were using e-textbooks compared to the previous year. And again, I think it's going to be a long time before we really know how permanent the changes will have been, and how broadly applied they are. But I think we both, in terms of sort of other use of digital means of instruction and in sort of digital materials, we did see sort of some of it may have been forced. It may have been, I think there were a lot of institutions where, especially when students were still dispersed, where digital textbooks became a much more logical way for institutions to make sure students had the materials than was normally the case. And I think we saw instructors probably more sensitive to student needs during the pandemic than maybe was historically the case. So I think it's not surprising that we have seen sort of an acceleration in the support for and use of digital curricular materials. And again, with some more support, again, as you can see here, for students saying they're more likely to view digital materials sort of positively than they were before. And I think, again, sometimes just sort of forced exposure, forced experimentation can make a difference. I want to talk a little bit about some of the different influences that we see in terms of how who's trying to drive movement in this direction, and what factors are involved are influencing the sort of take up and use of digital materials, and the push to make curricular materials more affordable, which is really the focus here. We have seen there's a clear government role, and we've seen certain states probably much more inclined to step in here and have some influence, as well as the federal government. We've seen state efforts. We've written quite a bit about the state of New York making some investments in the last few years in open educational resources, particularly, which we'll talk about a little bit. We saw the state of California invest $115 million in the creation of low or zero textbook cost courses. And we've seen a bunch of other states focus on things like transparency to try to sort of force the awareness of what textbooks cost, requiring colleges to put a textbook cost in the where students see the courses in the course handbooks and stuff, that where students may get to choose their courses, so that students can choose if they want a course that uses digital textbooks that are either free or much lower cost. And those are, of course, on top of broader efforts to try and drive affordability, and a lot of those are coming at the federal level. So far, we've seen a significant investment by this administration in Pell Grants, and again, efforts to continue to drive down to make college more affordable for students generally. And again, a lot of those efforts, especially the Biden administration's push for free community college and free, are focused on tuition costs and tend not to, unlike the Pell Grant, which can be used for curriculum materials and textbooks. A lot of the push to sort of limit tuition doesn't necessarily affect this problem, even if it does in certain ways make higher education more affordable for students. Scott?
Yes, first I want to thank one of our listeners who wrote in that accounting is another area where textbooks are hugely expensive, over $300. But I wanted to just make the point here that when people hear talk about requiring a tuition-free textbook or something like that, many think, particularly in academia, many think about, well, what about my senior seminar where I'm studying X, Y, and Z in a very specialized way? And that's fine. But most OER materials are for introductory courses. And in introductory courses, there are available a good low cost or no cost materials. And it's important to remember, and it varies as you advance, but there's probably a year or two's worth of free textbooks for those who want them. Doug?
Great. Actually, that's a great transition to talking a little bit about open educational resources, which are obviously in this sort of context of low cost or no cost curriculum materials. Open educational resources are one key component of that. Open educational resources, for those who aren't familiar, are free and freely available, and openly licensed curriculum materials. And as Scott said, they are typically focused on in sort of gateway and other sort of courses that are heavily used in the general education realm. And going back to sort of what we talked about a minute ago about the pandemic, it seemed like the pandemic would have been a logical moment for open educational resources to take off. And the early data that we saw, and we probably should be getting an update fairly soon from Jeff Seaman at Bayview Analytics that tends to focus on, does an annual survey of open educational resources. In the first year of the pandemic, we really didn't see the pandemic creating a more vibrant take-up of open educational resources. And the thinking really was that faculty members and to some extent students were so focused on just getting through it that they didn't have time and didn't necessarily take the time to completely remake their courses, which sometimes sort of using open resources does require. Sort of starting over with a new textbook may have been just more than a lot of faculty members felt like their students could handle or could handle themselves. So there is, I think we are absolutely, I think, likely to see potentially, as this downward pressure on on sort of affordability and the affordability of curriculum materials continues. I think there's generally a sense that open educational resources will continue to be an important element of it. And we are seeing, I think, more and more states, and we have also seen the federal government make some investments in open educational resources to try and drive that adoption and drive the creation of those resources and sort of awareness of them. The other sort of major evidence of lower cost textbooks has been, and we talked a little bit about it before, has been the publisher's own initiatives to drive down the cost of textbooks and curricular materials through their offerings. And again, they have been steadily transitioning their portfolios from print to digital. Many of them have adopted programs through which colleges contract with a publisher to make digital books available to their students on the first day of courses. They're called things like inclusive access, equitable access. There are a bunch of different names for them, but typically the universities get a discount on the materials. Usually the students pay it through a fee. Occasionally the institutions subsidize it for some of their students. And the way it's designed to work, and it's somewhat similar to OER, is again to try to crack this nut of, if students are to make it easy and ideally affordable for students to have access to those books from day one, with the goal of having them not be having to make a choice or choosing not to get the textbooks, which, as we said, can absolutely have an educational impact on them. And essentially, whereas students might have been assigned textbooks individually, institutions are signing up whole classes of students to automatically receive these digital course materials at a discounted rate. And so I think that, and these, what the publishers are doing and OER are somewhat in competition with each other. There are institutions that are blending them. There are certainly entities out there that are trying to bring all sorts of curricular materials together through various digital, platforms to try to give instructors a lot of opportunity and a lot of choices. I wouldn't dare predict sort of, how that competition is going to play out. I think in general, the competition for, lowering the cost of curriculum materials is good for students, and, healthy, I think, for the ecosystem as a whole. I want to remind you to offer some questions. We've got a couple more slides, and then we'll be ready for those questions. I want to talk a little bit we talked about some of the government initiatives. I want to talk here. You'll see on this slide several examples of institutional initiatives to try to to try to bring curricular materials to students more affordably. Some of these efforts are funded by philanthropies such as Hewlett and Michelson Philanthropies and other groups that are trying to hasten the push in this direction. And again, this, among the things that are talked about here, is a program at Austin Community College that to increase the number of courses with zero textbook costs. It grew from 29 in spring 2017 to 626 course sections in spring 2020. A lot of these are, again, there's a lot of these are stories are on our website. There was a program. There's been a program in the West Virginia Higher Education Policy Commission recently that was designed to sort of stimulate the availability of open educational resources. North Carolina A&T State University is providing free textbooks for 2 academic years starting this past fall, using federal stimulus funds that were, again, some of which were very much designed to try and make college more affordable for students. And the projection is that students would save about $1,000 in textbook costs per year, according to the Vice Chancellor for Business and Finance there. So again, a lot of institutions are experimenting and trying things. And again, that's the sort of, experimentation. Higher education is often criticized for not experimenting or not moving as fast. And I think we're seeing a lot of experimentation in this realm now. And I think that's, again, healthy and generally good for students. With that, it's time to want to offer, again, thanks to Bibliu. I want to start taking some questions. Scott, do you have a first question to address?
There are a few questions we got from skeptics of some of the publishing industry attempts to deal with this. One question is, really inclusive access lowers student choice. It's about the publishers gaining control, so every student has to pay and can't use library reserves, sharing texts, etc. Another person says, most of these plans do not allow students to shop for the cheapest version of the textbook. That's not equitable. And then another person says, inclusive access is a mixed blessing since the books have to be used from the same publisher. Bit of a monopoly mentality, it seems to me. We investigated this and are still pondering it at my university. So one thing I want to stress is that inclusive access does not need to be a be all and end all. It's not something that you needs to be your only approach to this issue. Whether it's right for your university or not is going to depend on a variety of things. But again, I would stress that inclusive access for the gateway courses, for the entry level courses, tends to have less of a cost to student in terms of the student not picking the book. The dirty secret, I suppose, is that Psych 101, you can take basically the same textbook from multiple publishers, and same for Econ 101 and so forth. So at that level, I would think, I think it could be used, and that, I would just push back a little bit against these questions. Doug?
Yeah, one question is being asked by somebody who I should have focused on this or should have mentioned this. This comes from a librarian, and I should mention the important role of libraries and librarians in helping to sort of drive the push for more accessible curriculum materials. This question says, IHE has previously published articles on student preferences for print learning materials and given a platform to researchers whose work suggests students learn more effectively with print. Do you think that this is no longer a factor for faculty now, and that they and students have accepted the value of digital and OER content that is born digital? But also, do you think publishers will want to go all digital to eliminate the used textbook market, which does save students money? And so a bunch of stuff is embedded in there, including, and yes, it is absolutely true that the availability of used textbooks also contributed to driving down the price of textbooks. Before the big push to digital, we saw a lot of competition for used textbooks and resale and lower priced textbooks on certain unnamed major platforms that then campus bookstores were charging, et cetera. And it was competitive in certain ways and at a certain price level. And the move to digital certainly affects that in lots of ways. And yes, per one of the questions Scott just referred to, the publishers do benefit when they get students using digital textbooks. A lot of those digital textbooks are only they're essentially rentals because you may only get to use them for a certain period of time. And there is no resale. And so that's one part of that question to address. The question of whether faculty members and students have accepted the value of digital and OER content that is born digital. I certainly think that is a slowly evolving trend. I think, and again, for all sorts of reasons, I do believe that some of the technologies for digital consumption of books and ability to take notes and to do certain things that students like to do in print have improved over the last 5 to 7 years. And I do think that the pandemic had some effect, the sort of general sort of awareness that sort of doing education digitally is legitimate, and I don't want to overstate that because I think that's still contested in certain quarters. But I think there is some movement. I don't think there's going to be, despite attempts to try and say, oh, it's going to be 100% this at some point. I think it will continue to be an evolution. I do think there are, I do think that the shift to digital will continue and probably pick up speed, but I don't think it's going to be absolute, because I do think that there remain, just like many of us still like to occasionally pick up a book or a newspaper. I do think that there are certain preferences that aren't going to just automatically disappear.
I've got two questions here about the faculty role. I was the chair of a committee that looked at this. We have largely moved to less expensive material, but many faculty are reluctant to change their course. Do you have anything to say about that? And one of our big problems is the instructors believe that not only is print better than online, but that students like to keep, or should be encouraged to keep, their textbooks, even into middle age. My experience is that even our older returning students prefer online, which they can listen to or read when they're commuting to school. So a lot there. First of all, I would hesitate to put all faculty in the same category here. I think there are many faculty who love OER, who spend time working to make OER better, and who are deeply committed to providing OER to their students. There just are a lot of faculty. Now, there's some suggestion here about age, and I do think that younger faculty members are more likely to, but are not the only ones who get excited by the changes here. What you need to talk to your faculty about, honestly, to the first question, is talk to them about the costs, the real costs of books. I was at a conference once where people were talking about this, and somebody said, he was talking to faculty members about it, and they sort of were like this questioner says, so we're reluctant to change. And then the faculty member said, well, but is it worth $150 for this book? And the faculty member was really troubled by that question. And he said, it's not. And I think in some ways you need to get very specific with your students, if you want, with your faculty, if you want them to appreciate the need to change. Look, this is all about change. It's not change that necessarily needs to devalue what the faculty does, but it is change, and people generally are slow to change, but they don't have to be. Doug?
Yeah, there's a question in here. There's several, but one that's pretty pointed, which is why is there so much unhappiness with OER? And again, I think there are reasons why some people object to OER. I do think actually the biggest barrier to the adoption of open educational resources is awareness rather than the concerns about quality. But I would say the major sort of reasons why some faculty members view OER, those who are aware of it, view OER as lesser than some of the material they may get from publishers, have to do, there are a bunch of reasons. One is the lack of sometimes the lack of non-textbook material, things like test banks. Somebody who submits somebody submitted a question here or made a point in here as being a barrier, particularly in STEM fields. This person says the publishers offer test banks with platforms that grade the students' work. Their OER is hard. OER requires having a faculty member. Well, I think we are seeing, and especially with some of the government investment, we're seeing more funding of the creation of textbooks, open educational textbooks and curricular materials. But the publishers fund that work for their own work, and without without comparable funding, it takes a lot of work for certainly an individual faculty member to sort of create create material out of on their own, or to sort of create a whole new curriculum for their class. And then some of the material, some of the existing textbooks that have been created don't necessarily have as many of the bells and whistles that the publishers are able to provide for some of their materials. And so for faculty members who don't want to take the time to work with their library or go hunting for good open materials, the publishers present the easy button in certain ways, but may or may not be what is in the student's best interest.
There's another reason too, which is that OER basically contains a vast range of quality of material. And the people rely on the publishers to vet the material and to tell them automatically, what's good, what's not good. And that expense in time is a real one. And I think that's another factor. I just want to read this statement. I am using a free digital textbook for a French class, and it is the best of all worlds. It is available online, so it is not a rental, and it will always be available to my students even after my class is over. Thanks to the people at UT Austin for this book. I can see from your presentation that they have had an excellent effect on community colleges in Austin. My hope is that there will be many more books such as this. It can be printed so my students have a print copy if they want. And that is just, that statement is just how you can win over faculty members and make them proud of what they're doing, and view OER as an educational choice to truly make things better for the students. Doug?
Yeah, we're edging into the some debate in the questions and comments about the relative value of OER versus some of what the publishers are proposing. Somebody writes, while inclusive access may reduce the cost for a course, academic freedom may create scenarios where faculty may use different inclusive access platform. This costs students in many times more than textbooks. In other words, what this person is saying, and I think this is accurate. I mean, one of the knocks on inclusive access is that if an institution aligns with one publisher's inclusive access provider, faculty members may feel like their options for the textbooks they can use are limited. If there are platforms out there that allow people to choose from among different publishers, but another situation that we have seen some examples of are students having to buy access to different publishers platforms so that they can cover the full gamut of their courses, and that adds up for students. So again, we are in the middle of a evolutionary process where this is all being sorted out. And I think what the sort of general sense that I think we can share is that there is downward pressure from external sources and internally to try and address this. And I think we're in that stage where we are seeing this be fought out, and there are pros and cons. And I think the key thing is that I do think that the sort of elevation of this issue as a public policy issue, as a matter for institutions to be aware of. And maybe the biggest change, again, from the pandemic, is I do think we saw greater faculty awareness about their students as people, and including as people with affordability issues and accessibility issues. And I do believe that if one of the biggest changes we've needed to see are faculty members caring about this and prioritizing their students' needs can potentially over, now they're not likely to prioritize it over quality. And so I those who believe that there's a quality difference are probably going to continue to be wary. But to the extent that it's about, can students afford this? Is this good for my students? I do think we're likely to see more movement toward things that benefit students.
Here are two questions. First one, this is not a question, but I've moved my classes to OER over a year ago. It took work, but not as much work as than using publisher created content. There's a lot of awesome, high quality, even peer reviewed OER content out there. I thought the publisher stuff was mediocre, so why have the students pay for it? Caveat, OER is not always useful for all courses, all levels. I couldn't agree more. And I just give that to you as an example of a satisfied faculty member using OER. There are many such faculty members, although there are many who will complain about it, which leads to the next question. We are contending with a negative attitude among faculty to OER also. Do you find it is from a lack of personal experience and based upon the fact that the materials aren't, oops, sorry, just lost my, or that the fact that materials didn't used to be as good as they are now. Materials are peer reviewed now. So a number of good points in that. One is that OER changes all the time. Where there hadn't been a directory, giving you good access to various OER materials, now that exists. And so I think that the automatic writing off of OER was dangerous and didn't make sense. But the fact is, OER is different now than it was 4 or 5 years ago. And many faculty members who complain about it haven't been as engaged every year. The other thing is that, you need to think about your textbooks. Were you happy with them throughout the textbook? Or did you find that the textbook, to take history, covered a certain period of time well, a certain period of time not well? OER can really solve a lot of your problems if that is the case. Doug?
Some fascinating, we could probably find a way to publish the back and forth here, and it would be a pretty compelling news article. Somebody writes, we have several multi-sectional courses that are taught by different faculty, each who choose their course materials. Some faculty and chairs push back against efforts to encourage them to use lower cost materials by arguing that it violates their academic freedom. What arguments can be posed in that scenario to counter the academic freedom issue? Listen, academic freedom is going to be cited by some faculty members about just about anything that tells them, that suggests that they don't have complete control over how they do their work, and I understand that, and that's sort of a long historical reality in higher education. I don't think. I think the main movement that I would see is not sort of arguing against that, but making the affirmative arguments for why limiting, I don't know if I want to say limiting choice, but by I think some of that's going to fade as the available options improve. Most people aren't going to cite an academic freedom argument unless they really believe that there's a quality issue. And I think the quality issues surrounding open educational resources and other lower cost materials it's going to take time for them to erode, but that's going to it's going to keep improving. And I'd go back to what I said a couple minutes ago. I think the strongest arguments for are sort of the pro-student ones. And I do believe that most faculty members want to do right by their students, and they're not going to do right by if they think they're not going to see giving students crappy material as doing right by their students. So I think it does, they have to be willing to do an actual assessment, and there has to be good enough quality material that they don't see themselves compromising their students. I do believe that more and more faculty members with each passing day, and again, I think the pandemic played a meaningful role here, recognize the affordability and access issues that students face. And I think the strongest arguments for lower cost education materials are those, not saying, oh, you shouldn't have to, not taking on the academic freedom arguments necessarily.
Deans and other administrators need to honor OER, just changed again, need to honor OER work in tenure portfolios. Is this changing? Yes, it is. I attended a conference several years ago on this topic, and it was about community colleges and OER, but it could apply to four-year colleges as well. And there was a college there that granted, release time to, if a professor was going to, put a bunch of materials on OER or evaluate a bunch of materials on OER, gave them release time to do that. They had to apply, but it was part of the process. Other colleges paid faculty members for evaluating or writing OER materials. And I do believe that there are faculty who are earning tenure. In the part, it doesn't need to be a separate category, but in the service category, which is real at many institutions, this can count. So I definitely think the questioner is correct that we need to look at the incentives and change them. Doug?
Yeah, there's sort of two related questions. One is one is somebody asking whether putting the cost of textbooks in the course schedule would bias people unfairly away from certain course sections. And then another person says, when students start registering for the sections with open and no cost textbooks, instead of the courses requiring expensive textbooks, maybe academic freedom will take a backseat to giving students textbook relief. Listen, there are lots of reasons why students might choose one section over another, including easier grading and greater proportion of students getting A's, et cetera. So to me, having more information is almost always better in terms of helping students, giving students agency over their own education. So I can't really see a strong argument against putting information in a course schedule about what the cost of a course material is. Well, in general, students don't pay pay differential tuition for different courses, but they do if one course section or one course requires a $175 textbook and one doesn't. And again, I'm not sure I would want my children or people I know to be making decisions exclusively based on that. But should it be a factor? Heck yeah, I can't really see why it wouldn't be. So, and I think the second person who wrote saying that it might help move the needle. Yeah, probably.
Here's a question. What would be a reasonable cost for a textbook for students that are cost prohibited for students? I'm not going to give a dollar answer, I'm sorry, but you need to think about, where is the student getting the money? Does the student have enough money? Does a low-income student get money from the institution? Or does it mean the student has to go out and work longer and harder? Or what's worse, to not use the book? A lot of students, skip buying books, and many times they don't use them at all. That is the real cost here of the textbooks industry, and people need to remember that your student may skip buying the books altogether, even if they're in your class. Doug?
Yeah, somebody just provided a link to a paper about the role of OER in tenure and promotion, trying to encourage faculty members to, embrace OER. And I guess what the issue that raises for me is in the whole set of questions around the faculty role and what professors do or don't do. Institutions have a lot more influence over faculty behavior than I think and I'm not talking about telling them what to do. I'm talking about training, support, rewards. Most of the faculty behavior that people tend to criticize involve the faculty making very reasoned decisions based on how they're compensated, how they're rewarded, where they think they get, where they think the institution, what the institution cares about. And the best way an institution can move the needle on things like this is by providing faculty members with better awareness and training about the importance of affordability, if the institution believes that's an important issue, encouraging experimentation, encouraging rewarding professors for good teaching, for teaching that, for changing up how they do their instruction. There are all sorts of ways where institutions can make a difference and drive behavior that they may not take advantage of. Scott, do you have something else you wanted to add? Okay. I want to, that's pretty much all the time we have for today. Really engaging conversation with all of you. Thank you so much for all your insights and suggestions and comments. We will, there's probably some that we can follow up with later because we got to only a fraction of the questions and comments that you submitted. Thank you all for taking the time. Really clearly an issue that touches people's interest. And thanks again to Bibliu for making this conversation possible. Hope all of you have a great day and a great rest of the week. Thanks a lot.